Today, we're looking at a fascinating piece of speculative fiction called The Ambulance Made Two Trips by Murray Leinster. It's a story that starts out feeling like a classic noir detective tale, but it quickly pivots into something much stranger, blending a gritty crime drama with a high-concept exploration of physics and probability. The story introduces us to Detective Sergeant Fitzgerald, a man who is essentially fighting a war on two fronts. On one side, there's the actual crime in his city, and on the other, there's the creeping rot of corruption within his own precinct. Fitzgerald is one of the few remaining officers who hasn't been bought, and that makes him a lonely figure. The man responsible for this decay is Big Jake Connors, a powerful racketeer who has mastered a very specific kind of control. Jake doesn't use bullets or threats to keep the police in his pocket. Instead, he uses luxury. He bribes officers with high-end gifts like exquisite meerschaum pipes and fine goods, creating a culture where the police aren't just ignoring his crimes, but are actively grateful to him for the comforts he provides. Fitzgerald watches all of this with a mixture of frustration and disgust, knowing that the law is being dismantled not by a violent coup, but by a series of very expensive gifts. As the story progresses, the atmosphere shifts from a standard police procedural to something more surreal. A series of bizarre, seemingly accidental incidents start happening around the city. These aren't your typical mishaps. In one instance, a man spontaneously catches fire while riding a bus. In another, a shotgun blast that should have been lethal somehow misses its target entirely, only managing to scorch a driver's hair. Then there's a car crash caused by a sabotage brake line, but the way the accident unfolds defies the usual logic of intentional sabotage. It's as if the universe is suddenly intervening to prevent certain outcomes, but in a clumsy, chaotic way. Fitzgerald, being a dedicated detective, starts digging into these anomalies. His investigation eventually leads him to a business called Elite Cleaners, owned by a man named Brink. When Fitzgerald meets him, it becomes clear that Brink isn't just a dry cleaner, he's the keeper of a secret. Brink reveals that his business is protected by something called a psi unit. This isn't a weapon in the traditional sense, but a device that can manipulate probability. Brink explains that the unit ensures his safety by shifting the odds of the world around him. To demonstrate how this works, Brink gives Fitzgerald a small plastic talisman. He warns the detective that if he feels his eyelid begin to twitch, it's a signal that he's in immediate physical danger. At first, Fitzgerald is skeptical, but he soon experiences the phenomenon firsthand. As he continues to investigate the string of targeted vandalism and near misses, his eyelid begins to twitch. Moments later, he finds himself narrowly avoiding falling glass or heavy objects that seem to drop from nowhere. The realization hits him that these accidents aren't random at all. They are the result of a localized manipulation of luck. The psi unit is essentially editing reality in real time to ensure that certain violent or harmful events simply don't happen. The tension reaches a breaking point when Big Jake Connors decides that Brink is a problem that needs to be solved. Two of Jake's gunmen enter the cleaning plant with the intent to intimidate Brink and shut him down. This is where the story really showcases the brilliance of Leinster's concept. As the gunmen attempt to commit acts of violence, the laws of probability shift violently against them. It's not that they're suddenly bad shots, it's that the world itself becomes an obstacle. A box of spot remover happens to slide across the floor and hit a dryer door, which flies open and disarms one of the gunmen. A spill of detergent makes the floor impossibly slippery at the exact moment a man tries to lung forward. Even the light bulbs in the ceiling begin to implode with a sound like gunfire, creating chaos and confusion. Brink explains the science behind this. He describes the psi units as creating an anti-violence field. He uses the analogy of magnetic fields creating eddy currents. In this case, the units create eddy currents in probability. When a person enters the field harboring violent intent, the unit detects that intent and shifts the statistical likelihood of their success. The more violent the intent, the more the probability shifts. The result is that the violent act becomes physically impossible. However, because the energy of that intent has to go somewhere, it manifests as an absurd, non-lethal accident. The more a criminal tries to force a violent outcome, the more ridiculous the failure becomes. Fitzgerald realizes that traditional policing is useless against a man like Big Jake, who orchestrates his crimes from the shadows and uses the police as his personal security. He and Brink decide to take the fight directly to the mobster. They confront Big Jake and his armed men in a final showdown, but instead of a bloody shootout, the confrontation plays out like a farce. Every attempt at violence is converted by the psi field into a harmless mishap. A punch misses and hits a wall, a club slicks from a hand, a shotgun blast is diverted by a freak occurrence. The criminal organization, which was built entirely on the foundation of the threat of violence, is rendered completely helpless. They aren't defeated by a better army or a smarter legal strategy, but by the sheer impossibility of their success. The story ends with the mobsters neutralized, not through a gunfight, but because the laws of physics have been weaponized for peace. Once the plot is settled, it's worth stepping back to look at what Leinster is actually doing with this story. At its heart, the book is a meditation on probability versus determinism. Most crime stories operate on a deterministic logic. If a man has a gun and pulls the trigger, the bullet goes where he aims. But in this world, the author suggests that the outcome isn't a certainty, but a statistical likelihood. By manipulating those odds, the psi unit removes the agency of the aggressor. It's a fascinating inversion of power. Usually, the person with the weapon has the power, but here, the person who controls the odds holds all the cards. There's also a subtle but important discussion about the ethics of fair play. Throughout the story, Fitzgerald struggles with the implications of this technology. At one point, the idea comes up of using the tech for something trivial, like fishing, to ensure a great catch. Fitzgerald refuses. He recognizes a fundamental difference between using technology to prevent violence and using it to cheat the natural order of life. For him, the integrity of the experience matters. He's okay with a world where people can't kill each other, but he's not okay with a world where the struggle and the chance of failure are removed from the human experience. It shows that Fitzgerald's moral compass isn't just about following the law, but about respecting the natural balance of things. The irony of the weaponization of peace is perhaps the most striking part of the analysis. The psi unit is, by definition, a piece of technology used to control others, yet its only function is to prevent control through violence. It's a paradox. To create a peaceful environment, Brink has to deploy a device that fundamentally alters the reality of everyone who enters his space. It raises the question of whether a peace that is forced by the laws of physics is truly peace, or if it's just a different kind of imposition. Finally, the story moves the conflict from a traditional struggle of good versus evil to a struggle of order versus chaos. Big Jake represents a kind of organized chaos, where the law is bent to serve the highest bidder. The psi unit represents a different kind of order, one based on mathematical probability. The mob is defeated not because they are evil, but because their method of operation, violence, has been rendered obsolete by a superior understanding of the universe. The title, "The Ambulance Made 2 Trips," serves as a clever nod to this theme of intervention and movement. While it doesn't refer to a literal ambulance in the way we usually think of one, it points to the idea of a system that steps in to correct a disaster. In the world of the story, the psi unit is the ultimate ambulance, arriving before the injury even happens to ensure that the disaster is diverted into something harmless. In the end, Murray Leinster gives us a story that is as much a thought experiment as it is a mystery. He takes the grit of a corrupt city and washes it clean with a bit of speculative science. It leaves the listener wondering what would happen if we could actually strip away the possibility of violence. Would we become more peaceful, or would we just find new, more absurd ways to clash? By turning a gang war into a comedy of errors, the story suggests that the most powerful weapon in the world isn't a gun, but the ability to make the gun simply fail to work.